Next from Springfield, we talk with Michael Jacoby, the Executive Director of Illinois School Business Officials, about the impact of the state's financial crisis on schools. He also talks about why his members fear the financial effect of shifting the cost of teachers' pensions to local school districts. This runs about 30 minutes.
Michael Jacoby, Executive Director of the Illinois Association of School Business Officials. Thanks for joining us on the Illinois channel. Everyone, I think, who follows state government at any level and understands that Illinois is facing a financial crisis these days. One of the largest expenditures that we have in state budget is for education, and so we thought it'd be good to touch base with you, as your members are the ones, the business officials, that have to make the budgets work and handle that aspect of education. It's a very important behind-the-scenes task that most people often don't reflect on. But what is it that is on your members' plates? What is their concerns right now, and to what extent is this fiscal crisis that the state of Illinois is having, that we often hear about in terms of the pensions, but what impact is it having, if any, on the, say, K through 12 education?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and thanks, Terry, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on these issues. I think our members are facing an onslaught from many different directions financially. So you have, at one end, the proration of state resources. On another end, you have a declining or flat property value scenario in many districts. And so you have your local resources being cut off, essentially, and you have your state resources being diminished. Federal resources have always been a small piece of the overall puzzle in educational funding, and yet now we're in a federal scenario where we have some shutdown and some concern about 2014 budgets and 2015 budgets related to that. So a member of mine sitting in an office trying to figure out how to balance a budget in the midst of all of that faces a lot of challenges. Not only do they face the challenge of community and state and federal expectations to increase the capability of the school districts to produce achievement in students, but they also face having to tell those same people we can't do the same things that we used to be able to do because we simply can't afford it. 2/3 of the districts in Illinois filed a deficit budget last year. That's an incredible sign of the trouble and problems I think that school districts are facing. We need to turn that around, and how do we turn that around? There's only two ways to do it: increase revenue, decrease expense. There's only two sides to the equation. But when you decrease expense, you're talking about people, programs, opportunities for children, and so forth. And every dollar that you cut affects somebody negatively. The revenue side doesn't seem to be a bright picture right now in the state of Illinois in terms of increasing monies from state sources. We do see some hope in perhaps an economic recovery on the local side, increases perhaps in prices of homes, businesses, and so forth. And yet I think everyone faces difficult issues that way, and we still have yet to see what will be the outcome, the fallout at the local level with things such as the Affordable Care Act that will affect local businesses and so forth. Is an increase in home values just a mirage, or will it continue to come back, and how long will it take to come back? And so our folks are watching all those particular issues and the impact that it has on them being able to balance a budget with people and programs.
You know, something, your members, again, are the business officials. Your members would not be necessarily the ones that set the salaries for the staff, would they be?
They would be involved in collective bargaining with teachers and with other support service personnel. In the end, it's the Board of Education that's going to approve any sort of contractual
the local school
relation.
Board, right?
Yeah. But in many situations, a superintendent, an assistant superintendent for business, or a business official are part of that negotiating team. And so they would be involved in identifying where they are competitively within their community and other communities around them, and what they can afford. Health insurance is a big piece of that, as well as salaries.
The reason I say, when we get into some of the cost structures, to what extent, I look at the federal budget, and something like 75% roughly is on automatic pilot. It's entitlement spendings. It's not that Congress doesn't start from a ground zero and put together a budget every year. To what extent are the schools also somewhat like that, or to what extent do you have the ability to cut costs and control your destiny, and to what extent are you inheriting spending, as we do, say, with Social Security and these entitlement programs at the federal level? To what extent are your budgets on automatic spending as well?
I think they are to a great degree. I mean, and part of that is driven by the fact that you have graduation requirements. So you have to offer courses at a high school that are going to feed those graduation requirements. Those are mandates. We're mandated to provide transportation services in many school districts. We're mandated to provide special education services to students based upon their needs. We don't have the ability to say no to some of those particular areas. So a lot of the budget does get carved out as we can't really touch this. Areas that we can touch are areas that we don't want to touch because we know it fulfills a student's experience. The arts, athletics, things that certain students, if they don't have those, they really don't have their life and their future in their schools. And so you've seen many districts have to go to the elective or what we'd say are areas outside of the common core, not common core from the standpoint of standards, but the core of education, math, reading, social studies, and English. Those things are there. But how much can we offer in AP biology? How much can we offer in music, in art, in home arts, other kinds of areas that certain students really depend on to be the core of their life in school? And so those are the real challenges.
Just as a general overview, if someone said, give me a shorthand thumbnail, how would you assess the economic health in general of the Illinois education establishment right now, K through 12? Is it a desperate situation? Have you hit the worst of it and you're coming back, or just how would you assess it?
My assessment would be that we are not at the bottom. There's probably still a bottom yet to be experienced. The choices that would happen at the bottom would be ones that most people don't want to embrace, because education would cease to be what we think it is today. We would be challenged to educate the whole child, and we would be essentially, I think, driven down to just a core educational system without any opportunity to grow students in areas outside of those core academic areas. People don't expect that in the United States. They expect a pretty comprehensive approach to their child's education. And even today, one example, with transportation cuts that we've experienced over the last several years, proration of the transportation reimbursement, many districts have had to start charging parents to transport their children to school. Well, in essence, that was just a shift of the burden of providing the service from a reimbursement through state tax sources to a fee at the local level in order to provide those things. You can do a few of those, but you're not going to be able to do a lot of those and still have a community continue to support the education that they have in their towns.
When I was covering Congress, we had a long debate at one point about unfunded mandates, and the governors were complaining about how the federal government asks them to do things, but then they don't give them the money to do it. Mm-hmm. You hear within the state, the mayor is saying the same thing. Now, you, the state, are asking us to do things, but you're not giving us the money to do it.
Right.
To what extent are you expending dollars because the state is demanding you do things that the state doesn't reimburse you for, these unfunded mandates?
To a large extent. Matter of fact, as we've dialogued with legislators about a potential cost shift in the pension reform proposals, we have said one way you could help would be to free us up on some of these mandates that are not currently funded.
Are there some that you can come to mind?
Well, absolutely. For instance, right now the State Board of Education is looking at a current rule. We call it a 70-30 rule. So if 30% or more of the students in your classroom have an individual education plan, regardless of the depth of that plan, just have a plan, that classroom becomes a special education classroom. And now all sorts of other class size limitations begin to apply that cause districts to spend resources to fulfill those mandates. The problem is that a lot of those situations have students with IEPs that don't really still get services. They may be actually on their way out of special education, but because they have an IEP, and we call them consult-only type of IEPs.
And what is that? You're using a phrase that most of us...
Consult means that basically there's just a pretty regular check-in to make sure that the student's still doing okay. But they're not receiving any particular services related to any disability. You might find that scenario, for instance, if you were dealing with a student with some sort of dyslexia at a young age, but you've been able to work that out. At some point they're not receiving direct services for that anymore, but in a classroom they still carry an IEP. And we still consult on that on an annual basis with the parents, with the teachers, to make sure that everything is still in a good situation.
So if someone had dyslexia, to use your example, do you have to send in a special education teacher in the classroom?
Depends on the severity of the disability. If, for instance, they need somebody to translate things for them, or they need, for instance, auditory help in regard to testing in order to do quality testing, then you would need additional personnel for that. But each individual IEP is going to specify that.
And the IAP, you say?
IEP, Individual Education Plan.
Okay.
Yeah. And every student that has an identified disability has a plan. We're saying to State Board of Education, let the plans rule over some arbitrary number like 70-30. And that's just an example of a case where there may be more resources expended than need to be expended because we're dealing simply with a mathematical formula rather than a real deep investigation into the student's needs. So we do that deep investigation, but that's not what rules the day. What rules the day is what's the percentage or proportion of students with an IEP in a classroom. So things like that could really change the opportunities for us to meet student needs better by focusing the resources on the needs, not focusing the resources in areas where there isn't a need.
Are you getting any reception to those ideas to say, look, untie our hands, let us make these decisions at the local level so we can see and spend the monies as they can best be spent and give us some wiggle room?
I think we get a recognition of the problem, but an articulation of the solution is a harder thing to find, because when you go down the pathway of a solution on this, let's take this particular issue, there will be a host of people that think if we let go of this rule, then schools are going to make wrong choices. We're saying the best people to make choices about the size of a classroom, the composite of a classroom, and all of that are the teachers, the parents, the advocates, the administrators at the local level. They're the best ones to make that decision, rather than a state rule. But people like state rules if they feel it's going to benefit them. And so now the whole issue of eliminating that rule becomes a political minefield. Unions will oppose eliminating that rule because they think it's going to eliminate jobs for some of their people. But when we talk to them and say there's only a certain amount of dollars, somebody's job is going to be eliminated, would you rather have it be something that's focused on the needs of the children, or would you rather have it be focused on a mandate from a mathematical formula? We think the needs of children should rule and be the better way for us to take a look at it.
As we sit here and tape this, one of the big discussions, of course, is we are at that point where we are beginning as a society to implement the President's Health Care Act, sometimes referred to as Obamacare or the Affordable Health Care Act. Is that as yet having any kind of an impact on the schools, or is that on your radar, or is that somewhat a little further down the road?
No, it's absolutely on the radar. In fact, many of the negotiations and collective bargaining scenarios that happened this last year began to change the language related to those kind of benefits in teacher and sports service contracts. The biggest concern for schools is going to be, do they have a benefit plan that ultimately will cause a penalty because it's a Cadillac plan, for instance? Or do they have a benefit plan that costs too much, and that's going to bring another penalty because it exceeds the proportional income test associated with the Affordable Care Act? So those are the key issues that people are looking at. I think, as we're seeing from other businesses, I just heard, I believe it was Walgreens, indicated they're going to put all their employees on the exchange as opposed to offering health benefits. People are thinking about those kinds of things. Is that a direction that ultimately we would end up going with public education? Very tough to get there because those benefits are negotiated.
And I don't know if anyone knows this yet, or if you have any insights. Do we know would that cost schools more money, or would it tend to save them money?
Well, that's what the question is, and we don't know the answer to that yet. And with the exchanges just opening, a week ago or so, and seeing what that's going to look like in the first round, I think we're still asking the question in that regard. The employer mandates, the employer penalties and such are future, so they'll be coming in another year or so. Right now, districts are doing a lot of internal testing to see where they might stand. One area that has really changed practice, under the Affordable Care Act, any employee that works 30 hours or more per week would have to have health insurance benefits. And so in education we have certain types of employee groups like substitute teachers that we haven't really monitored from that perspective in the past, and they typically have not received benefits. Coaching is another scenario that we're taking a good hard look at. If a teacher is a coach, they're a salaried employee, and so they're already in the benefit structure. But if somebody from the community is a coach and you're just paying them a stipend to coach, now we have to know how many hours do they coach, and do they buy coaching, and if they're exceeding 30 hours a week, does that qualify them for benefits? And it may not qualify them for benefits, but we have to have that data. And so there's a lot of analysis going on some of these ancillary elements of the Affordable Care Act that could be devastating for school districts if now they had to provide benefits to an entire group that's beyond what their current cost structure.
Before we close out, and we could talk all day on some of this stuff, but sometimes I think people look at schools and say, why is it that these cost so much? And to some extent we've discussed some of these issues, these unfunded mandates, the requirements of having to do something in a certain way. When we look at businesses over the last 15 to 20 years, they've made great strides in controlling their costs and cutting their costs by changing the way they do things, by implementing technology. To what extent, and I think people go, well, how come we haven't seen that in education? Why, we tend to hear, not necessarily from your organization, but just in general, that anytime we spend less on something, that's a negative thing, instead of saying, hey, maybe we just are doing it better and more efficiently. Mm-hmm. To what extent might we as taxpayers say, can't we get a bigger bang for our buck through maybe the implementation of technologies or other changes so that we can have, even as we've seen in the private sector, better services, better quality of product at a cheaper cost?
Well, more of that has happened than what people know. First of all, we really aren't just experiencing reductions in resources today. We've been really experiencing that for the last 13 years or so. There was a recession in 2000, 2001 that began to do that. The low-hanging fruit has already been cut from school districts. I mean, there just are not those kinds of extras out there anymore. I mean, it's even difficult anymore to have a cup of coffee for a faculty meeting because that costs money. But what has happened, and I think that a lot of it has to do with our membership as school business officials, we have implemented many, many efficiencies that people don't even know about. Pools that have been created to try and reduce costs in risk management areas, not just health insurance, but also in property liability insurance areas. Self-funding, so you take out the middleman and try to reduce those kinds of costs. Efficiencies in transportation systems, working through electronic means to focus routes more particularly so that you're not wasting any time, you're not paying drivers more time, you're not spending more gas than what you need to in picking up your students. All those things are happening every day, but people don't hear about that. And so they think sometimes that there's waste in government and schools are part of that. But I would say that in most classrooms, you have a teacher salary, maybe a teaching assistant if there's a requirement for that, and you have a minimal assortment of books and supplies. And those many times are provided by the teachers themselves.
I want to interject because you were going where that was, you were reminding me, we often hear as people that, we're spending thousands of dollars per child. I don't know what the base level of spending is now. What, in the area of $6,000 perhaps, or is it?
Well, the state foundation level is $6,119, but the average per pupil expense is more like around $8,900, I think, in Illinois.
And yet, for $8,900, close to $9,000, we hear about teachers having to dip into their own pocket to buy basic supplies, and I think people, we scratch our head and say, how is that possible? How by spending, if we have 20 kids in a classroom at $9,000, that's $180,000 a year for that one classroom. How is it that the teacher has to spend the money?
Well, because it's not just a teacher's salary that $180,000 supports. It supports the infrastructure of the facility, the fuel and economy, energy to run the facility, lights, heat, as well as getting the kids to school. There's a lot of other kinds of things, so it doesn't really center just around a single classroom unit. And part of the reason I think that teachers have always done that, and that's sort of been a part of teaching. When I was a teacher, I did that. Even at the high school level, I provided a lot of things just out of my own pocket because there wasn't any more resource in our budget. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with being able to recognize the needs before they're there. And that's a systemic kind of scenario. So a principal and a teacher need to be engaging upon what are the needs in my classroom and being able to articulate those into the budget process. We hear about that, but I would still say to you that the majority of supplies and materials are still provided through that $8,900. It's a few extras here and there that teachers are spending. And it might be in poorer districts, teachers are more committed to that than in districts that have a little bit more property wealth.
There are a myriad of issues that we could discuss and go on all day. One last one, and I'll leave it at that. We'll maybe have to get back together another time and do this again. Speaker Madigan, one of his proposals was to shift the pension costs. You alluded to that, but does your organization have any thoughts on that as far as what the impact, the economic impact, one way or another, would be on the schools?
Absolutely. We believe that if a shift were to occur, it's going to just add that one more thing on top of what I talked about previously, the diminishment of local revenues, the diminishment of state revenues. And granted, it might only be 0.5% per year, but that's 0.5% that we don't have right now. And so those would have to be dollars that would be committed from somewhere else. In this economy...
Let me see if because you deal with this, so it's very familiar with you. But so we're talking about having, instead of the state pay for the teachers' pensions, to have the local taxpayers pick up a portion of that.
Right.
When you talk about 0.5%, what would that be? 0.5% of your annual budget, or?
No. So let me kind of back up and just do a little bit of explanation on the, on the cost shift. The normal cost, which is the cost this year to support everyone within teachers' retirement system, runs right around 7 to 7.5% of payroll for those individuals. And right now the state pays that. And of course the state also pays its unfunded liability for the last 30 years or so that has grown to be so enormous. But that 7% is what we're talking about in terms of the shift of normal cost. And the proposals we've seen to date have said, let's increment that at say a 0.5% per year until it's fully implemented. So it would compound for you. You would get a 0.5% this year, next year it would be 1%, then it'd be 1.5%, then it'd be, and so forth. And the idea being that an incremental phase-in like that could be affordable to school districts. And my point is that we're already spending all the resources we have. There's very few school districts that are putting money away. Most are decreasing programs, decreasing costs. So even a 0.5% this year that grows to 1%, that grows to 1.5%, that grows to 2%, those dollars are going to have to come from somewhere.
And to remind the viewers, you already said 2/3 of the schools are operating in the red.
In a deficit
right
budget,
now.
right. So we have fears on that. And what we have said to them is that if you're going to do that, give us some mandate relief, give us some ability to make some decisions at the local level that would free up some resources. Let us also perhaps even include it in part of our tax structure at the local level. Right now, there is another pension system called the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund, which is fully funded, by the way, but that's funded by local property taxes. And so if you're going to shift us the teacher pension funds, perhaps you just combine those together and let those also be supported locally by something other than reduction of educational expenses and something else in the community. So both those issues have been addressed in terms of this dialogue over cost shift.
And again, relative to that, when you've had conversations with lawmakers, are you getting any reception on that, or is it falling on deaf ears?
No, I really felt there was a good dialogue this last May. Matter of fact, we went up to the last 2 weeks of the session with a pretty good expectation that we might be getting somewhere on the idea of tying mandate relief and local taxation to the cost shift. But as everybody knows, the cost shift went through for the universities in the House, and then it failed in the Senate. So everything pulled off the table pretty quickly at the end of the last session. I mean, we would prefer to have mandate relief without a cost shift, because we think mandate relief is something that really needs to be focused on. But if there is going to be a cost shift, there has to be a funding methodology, and it can't simply be absorb it into your current deficit budget. I mean, it's just not something that's going to work very well.
All right, well, Michael Jacoby, there are many issues again, and we certainly at least got some insights into some, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Terry.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.